You're listening to Ask an Economist from the Conference Board of Canada.
Hi, my name is Robin Gibbard. I'm a senior economist with the Conference Board of Canada. And I have a question here that touches on all of the new program spending that we've seen from federal and provincial governments over the past couple months to deal with COVID. And specifically, the questioner asks, how many weeks/months can we keep this up for? So thanks for the question. A great question, very topical. There is no simple answer to this question. There's no dollar figure that I can give you about how much we can spend or how much we can borrow. But maybe what I'll do is kind of explain a little bit about how government debt works and make some observations about the choices that we face about it. I will say off the top that I'm going to focus mostly on the federal government here. And that's because most of the new program spending is being done by the federal government. Certainly there is new spending by the provinces as well. But just to keep things simple, I'm just going to focus on the federal government. Most of these concepts will still apply to the provinces. It's just going to be the numbers that are going to be different, and therefore some of the choices that the provinces are going to have to make that are going to be a little bit different. So maybe just to start with some straightforward stuff. One way to interpret this question is kind of literally, when are we going to run out of money? Or when are we going to go to our creditors and find that they're no longer going to be able to lend us any more money? And I'm happy to say that on this front, there's really nothing to worry about. Canada came into this with some of the best credit ratings in the world. We're one of the safest places you can lend to. And right now, investors are really craving that kind of safety. But even beyond that, the Bank of Canada has promised to buy large amounts of both provincial and federal government debt for the foreseeable future. And since the Bank of Canada can essentially make money out of nothing, that means that we really run no risk of running out of money. So that's a good thing. Beyond that, I think it's also important to understand one important way in which governments differ from individuals when it comes to debt. So if you're an individual, at some point in your life, you're going to retire, and eventually we're all going to pass away. Governments don't face those same constraints. Canada is never going to retire or pass away of old age. And what that means is that, when the government of Canada is borrowing, technically it's promising to pay back this money on a specific date. But what happens in practice often is that instead of, paying that off when the debt comes due, what we'll do is we'll go to a new lender and borrow money in order to pay off the old debt. And so by turning over debts in this way, a country can really, drag out a repayment over a very long period of time. So there's this famous example that's going around lately where Britain, the country, didn't pay off its debt from the Napoleonic Wars until 2014. And so the magic of kind of being a government and being able to turn over debt in this way for such a long period of time is that if you have kind of a healthy rate of economic growth and a healthy rate of inflation, with time, what seemed like a very large debt to start with suddenly kind of shrinks into insignificance. Now, when we're talking about government debt, what I really want to convey to people is that it's not that important to focus on the dollar amount of debt that we're borrowing. What's really important to focus on is how much we're spending on interest payments on that debt. So Canada, we did have problems with debt in the past. In the 80s and 90s, we had a little bit of a debt crisis. And we did have high levels of debt then. But the real problem was that we were paying 7 to 12% interest on our debts. And what that meant was that in kind of the worst year in Canada for debt, the federal government spent 38% of its revenues just paying interest on its debts. Before it could spend that money on anything useful, any kind of program or transfers to individuals, it had to spend 38% of its income just paying off interest on debt. And that's a big problem. Now, things have changed a lot since then. And last year, the federal government spent about 7% of its income paying off interest on debt. So I went and grabbed the information, which is publicly available, about all of the new debt that the government of Canada has been issuing since the beginning of March. So basically during the most intense period now of COVID and the most intense period of supports for individuals and businesses. And for all that new debt, I looked at it and I averaged up the interest rate that we're paying on it. and found that for all this new borrowing we're doing right now, we're paying an average of 0.4% interest. So obviously, that's a very low number. And what it means is we had an estimate last week from the Parliamentary Budget Office that the deficit this year for the federal government is going to be about $250 billion. So if that's accurate, if we're going to be borrowing $250 billion this year, based on that interest rate I just said, 0.4%, it means that to carry that debt, it's going to cost us $1 billion in interest payments every year. Now, the federal government brings in a lot of money every year, and that $1 billion represents about 0.3% of the government's income. So basically, even with all the borrowing that we're doing for all these special programs, in order to maintain that debt, it's very, very cheap right now. So this is not something that people should be worried about too much. Now, as we roll over this debt in the coming years, that interest rate might change and it might go up, and it might become more expensive for us to service this debt and to just hold it. And I think at that point, that's when we're going to have to start making a choice, basically, about how we spend our money. We can either spend the money, on things that will grow the economy for the future or make things better today, or we can essentially save for the future by paying down some of this debt. And there's no simple rule for how we're going to make that decision. It's going to depend in large part on the specific interest rate that we're going to be paying. And it's going to depend a lot on the rate of economic growth that we can expect. Maybe I'll use that to segue into the final point that I'll wrap up on. And that's that Canada has done a really good job taking care of its fiscal house over the past 2.5 decades. Essentially, we've exercised restraint and we've saved for a rainy day, if you will. And that means that now that we're in this situation where things are bad, we do have the latitude to spend and to borrow as much as we need to get through this difficult period together. So there's no worry on that front. And as I said, I think we will have some choices to face about this debt down the road. But for now, we don't really need to worry about the sustainability of what we're doing. So really interesting question. Thanks a lot. I hope this was informative, and keep the questions coming.